Welcome to the Texas Conflict Coach radio program. If you've ever experienced or engaged in destructive or unresolved conflict, then you know it leads to broken relationships, distrust, and damaging results. Our program will help you manage and resolve conflict effectively with strategies, valuable resources, and support. Since 2009, our radio program hosted guest experts from around the globe sharing their perspectives, experiences, and expertise while giving you food for thought. If you can't listen live, then download and listen to any of our 300-plus podcasts in our library at texasconflictcoach.com. So sit back, relax, or join the conversation every Tuesday evening, or tweet us at TXConflictCoach.
Well, good evening, everyone. We kick off our new series on conflict in the church for the month of February. And churches are not immune to change and the conflict that comes with it. And in this episode, the Church Leader's Guide to Assisting Anxious People in Times of Conflict is our guest, Joey Cope. Now, he will identify the anxious people who will surface in times of controversy. What is the common element in all of this church turmoil? And what do church leaders need to be aware of when addressing these concerns? Now, we're going to learn from this conflict resolution consultant what church leaders can do and strategies that you can utilize to create a space and a non-anxious presence. Now, Joey Cope, who is he? He is the executive director of the Duncum Center, and that's D-U-N-C-U-M, like in Mary, Duncum Center for Conflict Resolution at Abilene Christian University in Abilene, Texas. Now, Joey is a Texas attorney and also the past chair of the State Bar of Texas Alternative Dispute Resolution Section and is the co-author of West Publishing's Texas Practice Guide, Alternative Dispute Resolution. Now, Joey serves on the board of the Texas Mediator Credentialing Association and has consulted with churches in conflict for more than 15 years. Now, tonight we have our chat room open, and there's a number of you already in our chat room, so welcome. Please leave your comments and questions in our chat room, and we'll try to bring them into the program, so thank you for your support. For those of you who are listening on the phone, want to join us in the chat room, just simply go to www.blogtalkradio.com/Texas, TEXAS, conflict-coach. We also invite you to participate in our Twitter feed and just use the hashtag TCC Radio. That's Texas Conflict Coach Radio, TCC Radio. And my Twitter handle is at TX Conflict Coach. And so we'll be in the Twitter room also doing that. And, again, leave your comments and questions there. We are not taking live callers, so those who are on the phone do encourage you to get into the chat room as well. But thank you for joining us in the studio. Joey, thank you for joining us tonight and kicking us off this February series.
Thank you so much, Patty. It's my pleasure to be with you.
Well, Joey, we go back a little bit, especially in the Texas community of dispute resolution. You're very well known for the work that you also do in the church, in addition to the work that you do in other countries and at the university. So, as we mentioned earlier, you are a licensed Texas attorney in West Texas at Abilene Christian University. And I guess the question becomes, what leads you and what has led you over time to the area of church conflict resolution?
Well, Patty, I really enjoyed helping people as a lawyer, and I represented a good number of churches over the course of my practice. Yet when that representation was tied to actual church conflict, I often felt that we were working in the wrong arena. We were just in the wrong place with those kinds of issues. And I really believed that people of faith should be trying to work with each other instead of against each other. So the application of church conflict skills like mediation and group facilitation stood out as a preferred approach to me. And then when we created the Center for Conflict Resolution here at the university, I had a natural opening to work with churches. So as a result, for now 15 years, I've had a front row seat to watch God work in these conflict situations.
All right, so let's get into that because, when we talk about church and conflict, that might bring up a lot of mixed feelings for people or like, people have these stereotypes or beliefs that all Christians should act in a certain way. So let's really dig deep into what your experience has been of the sources of conflict, which does cause this anxiety. And you talked to like times and controversy and change. So what is this anxiety and disruption in the church that's going on that you're seeing?
Well, as with any type of conflict, I think we see the most intense conflict the closer that people are or that they have been. And churches are like families. And so even the smallest things can ignite extremely difficult conflict. There are three things that we see quite often. One thing is a behavioral episode. Something happens within the church. I'd be quick to say that most conflicts in churches are not over pure theology. Most conflicts in churches spring up from interpersonal relationships, the behavior of one church member against another. Many of these clashes are over disagreements regarding particular incidents and may have nothing really to do with the church itself, except that maybe it was the location of the incident or that's where the two individuals are associated. One of the most dramatic church conflicts I've been involved in as a mediator was centered on two married couples. There was an affair between the husband of one marriage and the wife of the other marriage, and the church leaders had worked through the obvious theological problems regarding the sin and the infidelity, but the couples were left with the need to work out their ongoing relationship in their church and local community. And even though that seems like that's not church-related, because of their association at the church, that's where they centered their conflict. It was a very interesting time and a very challenging mediation to conduct. Another area, besides those behavioral episodes, is the interpretation of Scripture or church policy or polity or procedures that go on in the church. As churches try to be relevant in today's world, leaders are often placed in the position of reconsidering long-standing traditions and policies that they've had. This sort of change brings great anxiety in church members. In some cases, even accepted scriptural interpretation is called into question. For example, in recent years, there have been a lot of discussions regarding worship styles, gender roles, specifically the public role of women in worship in some of the more conservative evangelical churches. And then, of course, one that we hear about quite often in the news now, the relationship of a church with individuals who are in same-sex relationships. All of these sort of things cause conflicts within churches and even between churches. One of the reasons that we don't like change in church is that so much of our lives are just open to change in every single way. We often have looked at our past just in the last 30 or 40 years, and people would point to the stability of their workplace or the stability of their family lives and, of course, the stability of their churches. But suddenly that stability is starting to erode. People don't have long-term jobs security anymore, and the families, the fabric of families is very delicate. So when change in churches, particularly in some of these long-standing traditions and interpretation of Scripture come about, it's very disconcerting to the members. And finally, the third area that we see a lot of conflict is where a change is introduced within a congregation because of the leadership, a change in leadership, a change in pastor or minister, or a change in the community that surrounds the church. We often see major difficulties arising when a long-time minister ends his or her ministry with a church, or if they're dismissed. That's very disruptive to the body of the church and does signal a great change that's coming. Because, again, our church life is one of those stable places, we often want things not to change there. But yet we must see change in any area of life in order for there to be growth and for there to be continued stability and viability. So these are the three areas that we see. Again, the behavioral episodes, interpretation of Scripture, changes of policy, and then changes within the congregation itself in terms of constituency and leadership.
You know, so in all of these things that and I appreciate the specific examples that you just gave, and those are just a sampling of the samples, because I'm sure there's a number of things, but the common thread that I keep hearing, the common word that I keep hearing is the change. Whatever the change is that seems to be across the board to a lot of the sources of conflict. What more do you want to say about this change or the threat that people perceive from these changes?
A lot of people see change as a negative. I think many more people see it as a positive. But we used to say, as we talk to people, that hey, people don't like to be changed. And the truth is, people really don't mind change. They just don't want somebody else to change them. They want to change those things based on their own thinking. And so the change, the threat of change becomes a very personal affront, almost an insult to us, because if we didn't think of the change, then we're not pleased that that's where it's going, that we didn't have a say in it. But change is important for an organization like a church. Oftentimes it's stimulated by thought, by people looking for new opportunities. There's often a need among members that causes a change. And then we see also that churches can experience things that bring about change and change in behavior as well. For an example of that is many churches see a great deal of conflict following a tragedy. For example, if there's an accident involving a young person and a loss of life, or if there is a divorce among high-profile members, those sort of things often will trigger change or even the threat of change, and that causes a great deal of anxiety.
And here you are trying to work with church leaders and communities about creating, as you said earlier, this space and a non-anxious presence. And we'll certainly get into how we do that. Now, what do church leaders need to be aware of when addressing this type of anxiety, this turmoil, and the change? What do they most need to be aware of as you have been working with them for a number of years? So what would you like to say about that? Many times church leaders feel embattled, feel like they're being attacked because they're a central focus when there's a problem in a church. And they need to realize several things. Number one, most of the time, a sense of fear is the driving emotion with those people who are anxious within the church. They fear that something will be lost, that the church is actually leaving them, moving away from them. And that fear is a strong emotion, of course. When fear drives us, we move to a less rational state of thought. In fact, we don't think much at all. We just react to things. That's natural. That's our body's way of protecting us. When we were out in the wild and were approached by a threatening presence, we would run or we would learn to fight. And that's out of that fear. That fear drives that. We have that same emotional response in the church, and we react rather than thinking through about what we're going to do. So church leaders need to remember that the people that come to them who are anxious, they are still the good and mostly rational people they normally see, but right now they're reacting, and so they're going to be acting differently during this time, during this reactive state. Also, leaders need to remember that statistically, only a few church members in most conflict situations align themselves at the extreme positions in a conflict. The greater percentage of the factions in a church conflict
align themselves to people based on their friendships and their affiliation rather than the issue itself. So again, when we talk about problems in the church, it's often been said that if you have over 10% of the people actively involved in a conflict, you have a major church conflict. But part of that has to do with the fact that people will begin to follow those thought leaders as the conflict emerges. And one of the things too that church leaders experience is a great discouragement during this time of conflict, because one of the things that happens is some people just can't tolerate conflict at all. It's very, very uncomfortable for them. And what they'll do instead is they'll just leave the church community. But most people will stay and either work through it or perhaps become worrisome church members.
Even more anxiety, right?
That's exactly right.
Yeah, and I just wanted to clarify one thing. And when you talked about that, a lot of times there's a greater percentage of people who align with other people. To me, that sounds like there might be some on the extreme ends of conflict or issues, that there might be some polarization that might be happening in the church community. Did I pick that up, or anything more you wanted to say about that?
That's definitely true. We go into the protective mode, and just like any other conflict, what's frightening is that even within the church, we begin to personalize the conflict, and we begin to villainize other people, which, of course, escalates the conflict to even greater heights.
Okay, very good. So, folks, you're still in the chat room, in the studio, or in our Twitter feed. You are listening to the Texas Conflict Coach Blog Talk radio program, and I'm talking with Joey Cope with Abilene Christian University's in the Duncum Center for Conflict Resolution, and we are talking and kicking off our series about church and conflict. And Joey has been talking a great deal about some of the sources of conflict and where the common thread seems to be the change or the threat of change, and what leaders need to be aware of, and when leaders are feeling attacked by church community members only because they're in this place of fear and anxiety that's driving that emotion, and as you said, they're less rational. So leaders needing to be aware of where people's motivation or intention is coming from when they're dealing with that, and then almost like how do they step back then to be dealing with these types of individuals who are dealing with their own threat of change. And so as a leader, a church leader, what kind of anxious people confront us, or that you have discovered as they are working through their difficulties? So what are the types of people that they're encountering?
I've identified 8 distinct personality types or types of behavior that people exhibit, and just because of time tonight, I want to concentrate on 3 that we see most often. The first is what I call the chronic worrier. This person is highly emotional when they're provoked, when they're worried, when they feel the anxiety from the conflict, and even when they're not on edge about that, they are still prone to become excited about change and about possible ways that threatens them. But while they're there, while they're provoked, while they're emotional, they are on the edge, and they talk a lot about the worst possible case in any given situation. And it's almost, if you get several of them working together, it's almost like they try to one-up each other on how bad things could be in the particular conflict. I'd like to say, though, that most of the chronic worriers are often well-intentioned, but many times they're underinformed. So what I ask leaders to do is to spend additional time with these people, trying to understand the sources of their worry. If they can do that, if they can talk them through that, oftentimes they'll become some of the strongest supporters of leadership and some of the most creative people in terms of working through the problems and the conflicts. But if they're ignored, or if they're simply pacified, they can become non-specific grumblers, and where they worry about everything. And often they will trigger additional conflict because they will spread misinformation and fear, sometimes unintentionally, but sometimes because they simply want to see something happen. That's a dangerous thing for churches, and a trap that church leaders need to avoid. So the chronic worrier is one of those personality types. The second one is one that we often, many of us in various organizations see, and we often talk about them and tell humorous stories about them, but yet they're a very important part of this mix. And that's the slippery slope worrier. As you know, the slippery slope is that slope that once you take a step, you're just not going to be able to stop, and certain catastrophe will follow. This person is convinced that any change, will eventually lead to doom and ruin for the entire church. It can be comical because the way that the cause and effect reasoning that they use is, it's just comical in some cases. But I want us to make sure that we don't dismiss these people out of hand, because in truth, they're right. Change does often lead to additional change. Probably not to the extent that they've dramatized it, but there will be additional change. I've seen leaders make the mistake of telling someone, don't worry, we're only going to make this one additional change, and then everything will stay the same from this point forward. And, of course, it doesn't. And at that point, the leaders have real credibility problems, and the members, not just the slippery slope worriers, but others who observe this, have a certain amount of distrust for the leaders. So it's very important to communicate openly with these people and to work with them carefully. In addition, slippery slope worriers, unlike sometimes the chronic worrier, are very vocal, sometimes extremely vocal. They're often very few in number, but they're constantly calling against change, and that vocalization may eventually lead to the tyranny of the minority, where leaders just shut down in terms of new direction because they're tired of hearing this constant negative reaction to any change. So the leaders should make time to look at the fears of these people and to address them. And if they can't be appeased, then the leaders should also work to bolster the confidence of other members so that the congregation as a whole can move forward and accomplish what they need to within their mission. Finally, the malicious worrier. This is one that most of us think about when we think about church conflict. These people that have evil intent, and I don't want to paint this too vividly, but there are a few individuals in most churches who are the malicious worriers, and by that, what we're talking about is the folks that are looking for any chance to bring division to the church. A lot of times the issues that they choose, the conflicts that they grasp to complain about, are not even truly issues for them, but they see them as an opportunity to attack the leaders or perhaps even other members. And I believe that church leaders must make an effort to work with each and every member of their congregations, and so they should be trying to work with these people as well. They also need to remember their duty to protect the church as a whole, and sometimes that would call for the exercise of some sort of church discipline. Okay,
so those are 3 of the 8. Now, if people wanted to know more about all 8 types, where would they go to read and learn more about that?
I'm doing presentations in Lubbock at the end of this month, and in Georgetown, just north of Austin, in April, at an event that the university sponsors called ElderLink, and I do a complete session on shepherding the anxious within a church, and talk about all 8 in that. In addition, Abilene Christian University is offering an e-connection course, an online course that will start mid-March. And if people want more information about that, they can go to our website to find those details and to sign up for that.
Well, I wanted a chance to bring that in right now while we were on this topic of the personality behavioral types and examples, especially of the chronic worrier, the slippery slope worrier, and the malicious worrier. And again, listeners, that's just 3 of the 8. And I appreciate you being very specific again of how that's described so that leaders can start to recognize what it is that they're seeing and hearing. And what was interesting in that conversation is not only the things they need to be doing, but the traps to avoid. And a couple of things that I heard you say about these traps that leaders want to make sure is not to pacify, not to promise things will stay the same or there'll be only some small change, and then they set it up for potential failure or distrust because they made these promises. And so really, like you said, it's about learning to recognize these fears, learning to to be able to educate for those who are uninformed, to really listen, to be able to take whatever action. So there's a number of things there, but these traps that they have to be careful. And of course, it might be their interpretation of what they think they might need be to do, but you're saying, beware, because that could be a potential trap if you go in that direction. So speaking of additional strategies as we move toward the end of our program, because there's a couple of things I want to make sure we address. And in general, what can church leaders, or for that matter, folks who bring you in, like conflict resolution practitioners, dispute resolution practitioners, whether they're mediators or conflict coaches or whatever it is that they're bringing in and working with church leaders, what can they do to create this non-anxious presence? And maybe you even start with how you define non-anxious presence, but what can they do and what can people like yourself do to help?
It's interesting as we talk with people who have been in conflict and we ask them who are the people who have been able to help, it is almost always the person who is we'll describe as this non-anxious presence, someone who is not reactive, who is thoughtful, who is appreciative, is empathetic. Sounds a lot like a mediator, doesn't it? It's exactly the type of characteristics that we look for to work and for church leaders to have. And many times when I do trainings for church leaders, I ask them if we can't do some training in mediation simply because it puts them in that role of the non-anxious presence. One of the things that Peter Steinke in the book, Congregational Leadership in Anxious Times, I believe you have it listed on your website, one of the things he talks about is the need for leaders to differentiate. And they need to differentiate between 2 life forces, individuality and togetherness. And we see that other places. Many of us are aware of the dual concern model, where we see the 5 different ways to handle conflict. And it's called dual concern because along one axis it's a concern for self, and the other axis is a concern for others. And so again, that theme of individuality and togetherness. And here at the Duncum Center, one of the things that we embed into everything that we teach and train is that if we can balance those life forces, individuality, togetherness, self versus others, that we can find peace in the midst of conflict. So leaders need to be able to do that. They need to distinguish when they're dealing with people in the church, the reactive things that are happening versus the thoughtful, responsive things that are happening, and they need to honor both. They also need to create a safe space for people to talk and to air their grievances or just to talk about their fears. And primarily, they need to work on the trust issue. They need to think clearly, and they need to think ahead of time because it's difficult to think in the midst of conflict. They need to operate from a platform of principle where they're making decisions based on things that they'll be consistent in time after time. And another thing I see some leaders not doing well is sometimes they're not very clear about the position they have taken as leaders. They leave things floating around during conflict. And the members of the church need to be clear about the position that their leaders are in. And then, of course, communication. Communicate as many ways as you can. In one of the churches I worked with, a very difficult decision they were making, and they came up with, I believe it was 9 different ways to communicate the same thought. At the end of the process where they went through that and where they decided about the change, the people who left almost without fail said, "You never communicated anything about this." There were 9 different pathways that were open to them. So communicate all that you can. And then obviously be aware of your own response to conflict as a leader. You've got to be open. You can't be easily hurt. You need to listen and keep that calm, quiet presence.
You know, what was coming up for me as you were talking about some of the things that the leaders need to do more of, be better at, be more self-aware, but it made me wonder if some of these church leaders fall into some of these personality types that you talked about, the chronic warrior, the slippery slope warrior, or the malicious warrior. What has your experience been with the leaders falling into those behavioral type categories, which, of course, I'm sure really makes an interesting mix because in their, as you said, the goal is for them not to be reactive, but they might be one of these personality types.
Well, as a church consultant, I was kind of hoping you wouldn't open that door because as church leaders listen to this, they don't want to hear that, but that's exactly true. Many times when I go into work, I most often am called in by a church leadership, as you imagine, and many times they take on the role of we're the embattled ones, we're inside the stockade, we're the good guys, and yet as you begin to talk to members of the congregation about the problem, you find out that oftentimes the leaders are acting in the same difficult, anxious ways that the members are. And that obviously, again, it erodes trust, but it also puts the leaders in a position that they're just almost totally ineffective in dealing with the conflict themselves. But yes, you've forced me out with that statement, but that's true. Many of the leaders have those same personality traits.
Well, the thing about it is there's a vulnerability to being able to talk about that and to be transparent about that, so that not only are you going in and helping, assisting, supporting church leaders or conflict resolution practitioners are going in and helping church communities, but also that there's support for them as church leaders and how they can be more effective, constructive, and part of that comes to their own ownership, if you will, and personal responsibility about how they engage and think about conflict. And so I think, for them to put themselves, and I don't know if I'm offending anyone by saying this, but by putting themselves above church members or community to think that they're in a different place, to me says, they're supposed to be there to lead, and we look to them for leadership, but they're vulnerable like everybody else. And so once they start to recognize and take some ownership of that, then I think that they can start to make their own changes of how they can be more effective as church leaders when they're dealing with these types of interpersonal disputes or the changes that are constantly happening in the church. So organically it was just coming up for me, and I'm like, I just got to put it out there and see what it is your experience was with that. So.
You are right on target with it.
All right. Well, listen, we are starting to come to our closing section of the radio program, and I appreciate everyone who's been in the chat room listening in and in the Twitter feed and those who've been in the studio. And so a couple of things. For those who've been longtime listeners, we know that you get some type of field work or a call to action. And so, Joey, what do you have for our listeners tonight?
Well, I've got 2 things. First, for the church leaders, I'd like to point them to the 17th chapter of John in the New Testament, where God is addressed by Jesus in 3 prayers. There is the third prayer in that chapter is a prayer that Jesus prays on behalf of all of us today, over the followers who have come down through the ages. and he calls for unity in that. And the reason that unity and peace among church members is so important is that the way that the world sees God is through the members of the faith group that serves him. So church leaders, if you ever grow weary of dealing with conflict, just remember that it is a God-given mission for you to bring unity within your churches. So go to that 17th chapter, read all three prayers, but dwell especially on that last prayer of Jesus. And for anxious church members out there, if you've got conflict going on at your church, or even if you don't, remember that conflict is a part of life, and that the church is like a big family, and that natural conflict can be uncomfortable, but also can help us to grow. Also remember that part of the message of most religions is the fact that the higher being, our God, wants to reconcile with us, wants to have a relationship with us. So we have a responsibility to claim our ministry of reconciliation, as it's described in 2 Corinthians, that we also have, and this is your assignment this week, go out, anyone that you disagree with at church, and try to find as much common ground as possible to work with them on those problems.
Well, that's a good one for both the church leader and the church member. Okay, looking for that common ground. Okay, and you said 2 Corinthians as well is a reference in the Bible that you are referencing
yes.
the church members as well. Okay,
right.
Very good. Now let's go back to how people find you. You talked about a couple of workshops that are happening. So one, how do they find you in your blog and things of that nature, and anything that you want to highlight, whether it's a book or training, etc.?
Sure. People can look for general information at our website, which is www.acu.edu/conflict, and that will take you to our Duncum Center website, and there are links to our blog site and to other various areas there. Also, the workshops I mentioned, where I'll be speaking in Lubbock, Texas, and in Georgetown, Texas later on this spring, will be information there will be available at the Seibert Institute for Church Ministry on the ACU website. So if you'll go to that acu.edu/Seibert Institute, or SICM, you'll get information about those ElderLink programs. And then also on that same website, there is information about the E-Connections course that I'll be teaching on anxious presence in church, and we'll have information up on our website in the next few days on the www.acu.edu/conflict website on how to get to that other information. I'd also like, Patty, to invite people to read my blogs. I have one that concentrates on peace building and conflict resolution, which is Peace Bites, PEACEDYTES.org. And then I have a more eclectic, sometimes fun, sometimes very serious personal site at joeycope.com, and would love to have people join me there.
Well, a lot of wonderful resources, and on the program pages, listeners, for Joey Cope at Texas Conflict Coach is also all of the some of the book references, Peter Steinke's book reference, Congressional Leadership in Anxious Times, as well as all of these websites. But I encourage you to go directly to the websites that Joey encouraged you to do. But if you forget them, didn't get a chance to write them down, all of the information is on the program, and you'll be able to listen to this recorded podcast as well. So, Joey, what final message do you want to leave with the listeners tonight?
Well, for each of you, I want to encourage you, whether you're a leader or a member of a church in conflict, I want to encourage you not to give up. Peace is not the absence of conflict, and God understands this. In His Sermon on the Mount, Jesus reminded us that those who make peace will be called the children of God. Those who promote conflict, especially within church, can be called a lot of things, but never a child of God. So choose your name wisely. Thanks again for letting me be with you tonight.
You're welcome, Joey, and thank you all the listeners for joining us tonight in all the various ways that you've done. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for listening to the Texas Conflict Coach. We hope you've enjoyed the program. You can find over 300 podcasts archived to listen at your own convenience at texasconflictcoach.com or download the podcast at iTunes or Stitcher Radio. To learn about upcoming radio programs and resources, sign up for our monthly e-newsletter.